What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to show you how to crush the fried liver attack as black, starting with the move knight to g5. This is the start of the fried liver. Now, what is white's idea? Of course, he is targeting f7 with the knight and the bishop, putting a lot of pressure on that weak pawn. Now, this trap is very, very dangerous, but if you know how to counter it, and I'm going to show you a very special counter trap as black, if you know how to counter it, it's nothing to be feared. But first, let's back up all the way. This trap occurs after the moves e4, then e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian opening, the most popular line at the amateur level. Then we go knight f6, the two knights defense, and finally white does go knight g5, the start of the fried liver attack. And of course, if black ignores the threat, let's say he goes bishop b7, then white just flies in with the knight or the bishop, wins the pawn, maybe the rook as well, and from there, white is completely winning. But instead of that, in this position, we are going to go for the move d5, counterattacking in the center immediately. Now here, there is a very important trap. White almost always takes on d5. E takes d5 is the best move. And here, if black plays the move knight takes d5, this is the traditional fried liver. Here, white actually sacrifices his knight with the move knight takes f7, and after king takes, the key move is queen to f3, forking the king on f7 and the knight on d5. This is incredibly dangerous for black. You don't want to play this. I mean, it's just not a fun line to play as black. So instead, on move 5, we're not going to go knight takes d5, and also, we're not going to go knight to a5. That is the traditional main line. Black goes knight a5, white goes bishop b5, c6, and so on. It's a very complicated line. White has so many different ways to play this line. So instead, after the move e takes d5, we're actually going to go for the very, very rare move knight d4, jumping in with the knight, a much more aggressive idea from black. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It's very simple. We're setting up all kinds of threats against white's position. Now here, for white, the main move that amateur players play, I mean, even all the way up to the highest level, d6 is the move. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. White is opening up the attack of the bishop and renewing the threat on f7 with the bishop and the knight. However, this is just what we want white to play because we are ready. In this position, we don't defend f7. Oh no. Instead, I recommend the move queen takes d6, recapturing the pawn in the center of the board. Now, at first glance, this looks suicidal. After all, white can simply take on f7 with the knight or the bishop, but either way, black is perfectly fine. And in fact, if white isn't careful, we're going to lay a counter trap that will blow white off the board. Now here, most white players will go bishop takes f7, winning the pawn with check. I mean, what could be more natural than that? But it turns out it's actually not that dangerous. Here in this position, we just go king to e7. The king moves, but it turns out we are just fine. And already black is threatening the move h6, driving back that knight and winning the bishop. For example, if white castles here, that is a huge mistake. We just go h6, driving back that knight, and as soon as the knight moves, say to f3, we just capture on f7. King takes f7, and suddenly we have 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces versus the 1, 2, 3 of white, and we are just dominating here. So instead, on move 8, white is going to have to go bishop b3, retreating the bishop, but here black again is perfectly fine. We take on b3, knight takes b3, and no matter how white recaptures, usually a takes b3 is the move. We go h6, again driving back that knight, and after knight f3, then we go for the move e4 in the spirit of the two knights defense. This move e4 is so strong because it drives back that knight on f3 and forces white to make yet another concession, and already here, I mean, white is in serious trouble. The most natural looking move for white is going to be queen to e2, targeting the pawn on e4, and beyond that, of course, the pawn is pinned. You can't take on f3, as in the king on e7 would be exposed. But this is what we want. In this position, all we have to do is slide the king over, king to f7, and look at this. The threat on f3 is renewed, the king is off the dangerous e-file, and black is doing great. I mean, where is the knight going to go? Let's say it goes to, I don't know, h4. Then we play the move g5, targeting that knight, and the knight has nowhere to go once again. If you go to f3, you get captured. Sorry, f3, you get captured. If you go to f5, the bishop takes it. And finally, g6, the king takes it. The knight has literally nowhere to go. Black is going to be up a piece. Beyond that, you can't go to d4. The queen controls that square. You can't go to g5. The pawn controls that square. In fact, in this position, the only decent square for that knight is going to be g1. But as soon as white does that, we fly in with our bishop. Bishop g4 is our move, targeting the queen and setting up rook to d1 ideas, bringing yet another piece into the attack against white. And I mean, look at how fast things can go wrong for white. Let's say he tries to block the attack with the move f3. Then we take on f3, e takes f3, the knight takes, and then bang, rook to e8. The rook slides in, pinning the queen to the king on the e1 square, and black is winning on the spot. So let's go way back to this position right here after queen takes d6. Of course, white went d6. We were captured with our queen. And as we can see, bishop takes f7 is not dangerous at all. But what if white takes with the knight? Well, it turns out that is actually even worse than bishop takes. And this is completely losing. Now, at first glance, this looks so strong. After all, white is capturing on f7 with the knight, forking the queen and the rook on the h8 square. However, here we have a very simple idea to punish white immediately. We just slide our queen over. Queen to c6 is the move. Now look at this. Our queen lining up with the bishop, but also the pawn on the g2 square. And what is white supposed to do? Let's say he takes on h8. Knight takes h8. I mean, what could be more natural than winning the rook on the h8 square? But it turns out this is a massive mistake. We fly in with our queen and we actually don't take on c4. Instead, the pawn on g2 is our juicy target. We go queen takes g2, and now look at this. We're threatening queen takes h1, winning the rook on the spot. This virtually forces rook to f1, but now here in this position, black is spoiled for choice. We have two completely winning ideas, bishop g4 and queen to e4. Let's start with queen to e4. This move is very, very simple. Now, of course, the idea is we are targeting the king on the e1 square. And let's say white tries to block it with the bishop e2. Well, that is just music to our ears. We fly in, knight to f3, and look at this. The knight delivers the checkmate as white cannot take on f3 as the bishop is being pinned to the king on the e1 square. Black is completely winning. Now, instead, if white goes queen to e2, then we just take the queen with the knight. Knight takes e2, and after bishop takes, we can do literally whatever we want. Bishop g4 and so on. There are a million good moves there. So overall, queen to e4 is a great move, but we can also go bishop to g4 here. Look at this move, targeting the queen on d1, and what can white do? I mean, again, if he goes bishop e2, then simply bishop takes e2, and again, the queen will be lost. The queen is under attack and has nowhere to go. Instead, if white goes, say, f3 here, trying to block the attack, then our idea is bishop takes f3, and if rook takes, we recapture with the knight. Knight takes f3, and again, the only way to avoid mate, keep in mind, the queen controls all of these squares, and the knight is delivering an attack on the king. The only way to not get checkmated is to go queen takes and then queen takes, and suddenly black is up a queen. So obviously, knight takes f7 here is simply no fun for white at all. What else can white do in this position right here? Well, it turns out the strongest move for white is going to be d3. This is the move that white should play if he wants to fight for an opening advantage. But even this isn't that hard to deal with as black. Here we just go bishop g4, flying in with the bishop, targeting the queen on d1 immediately. And now, what can white do in this position? Let's say he goes knight takes f7, trying to win a pawn. That is technically the strongest move here, ignoring the attack on the queen and instead counterattacking against black's queen. In that case, we simply trade queens. Bishop takes d1, knight takes d6, hits with check, bishop takes, king takes, and then finally knight g4, counterattacking against the very weak pawn on f2. And overall, black should be just fine here. He is doing outstanding. Now, on move 7, instead of d3, white has some other options. Short castles is technically possible, but even this move isn't that good. Here, we simply go bishop g4, flying in with the bishop, pressuring the queen, and of course, if the queen slides over to e1, that is a huge mistake. I'm giving that 2 question marks, because then we fly in, knight takes c2, forking both the queen and the rook on the a1 square. So, white obviously cannot do that. Instead, f3 is very common, but then we just back up, bishop h5, and look at this. The bishop suddenly is defending f7. That is one of the unique ideas behind bishop g4 in this line. If white ever goes f3, we can retreat, and we are defending just in time. Now, here is a sample line showing some of black's ideas in this line. If white goes c3, targeting that knight, we can actually ignore the knight and simply go h6, putting pressure on that knight on g5. And now here, look at this. The main line goes knight takes, bishop takes, king takes, c takes, queen takes d4, and after the king moves, then simply rook d8, and black has a tremendous position with very good control of the semi-open d-file, pressuring d2. Beyond castles, white can also go for the very aggressive idea c3, trying to drive back that knight immediately, but even here, black is just fine. Look at this. We just go knight to e6, and here white's bishop on c4 is blunted. It's no longer targeting f7. If white takes on e6, we take back, and we're doing just fine. Here's a sample line, d3, h6, driving back that knight, knight e4, knight takes, d takes, then we can just trade queens, queen takes, king takes, and finally bishop d7, setting up long castles, getting our rook to the d1 square, opposing the white king on d1, and we're doing outstanding. So overall, this entire line, starting with the move after knight d4, if white goes d6, again, targeting f7, we can ignore that threat and just go queen takes, and very importantly, no matter if white takes with the bishop or the knight, black is doing outstanding. This is just a fantastic way to counter the fried liver attack. But of course, white is going to have different ideas beyond d6. In this position, white does not have to go d6. Instead, the strongest move here for white is going to be c3. Now, this move is less common, but you do need to understand how to counter it as well. When white goes c3, in this position, we're actually going to go for an insane move. That is the move b5, counterattacking against the bishop on c4. Now here, if white takes on d4, obviously we recapture on c4, taking that bishop. Here is a sample line. C takes d4 is met by b takes c4, and then here, if white takes on e5, d takes e5, that move looks very natural. I mean, after all, you win a pawn, you threaten the knight. Where is the knight going to go? Well, it turns out in this position, black has an unbelievable idea. Here, we can actually ignore the knight and just go queen takes d5. The idea being the pawn on e5 is pinned to the knight on g5. If white takes on f6, we recapture on g5, and we're doing outstanding. For example, e takes f6, queen takes g5, winning that knight. And here already, let's say white takes on g7, f takes g7. In that case, we recapture, and look at this. All of our pieces are suddenly going to these outstanding squares. The bishop on g7 slicing down the board. The other bishop likely heading to b7, slicing down the board as well. And of course, the pawn on g2 is so vulnerable. For example, if white goes queen f3, a very logical trying to pressure the rook on a8 and also defending g2. Then we just go then we just go queen to e5, sliding the queen over, and if white goes queen to e3, then bishop b7 is very strong. Again, the queen is defended more than enough by the bishop, and the other bishop slicing down the board, targeting g2. Black is doing outstanding. Now, instead, after queen takes g5, obviously f takes g7 is not a very good idea for white. Instead, queen to f3 may be the strongest move. But in that case as well, we're doing outstanding. Rook b8 defends the rook from the queen. Then white may want to go, for example, short castles, but then we take on f6. Queen takes f6. Now, if white takes on f6, queen takes is met by g takes, and black is doing just fine. Instead, rook e1 might be the strongest idea, but then we just go king to d8, sliding our king over, and if queen d5, then bishop d6 is very strong, and suddenly, look at this. This bishop slicing down to h2, the other bishop likely heading to b7, targeting g2, and again, black is getting tremendous play. So, after c3 and then b5, instead of c takes d4, the strongest move here, it's very counterintuitive at first glance, is actually bishop to b1. Now, Gukesh recently played an idea just like this against the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, and it is a very tricky idea. You retreat the bishop, get it out of the attack, and the point being, once the knight moves, then the pawn on b5 will be undefended, and then you can take on b5. So the main line here goes knight takes d5, c takes d4, and then queen takes g5, and suddenly the queen is very active, but of course, white can go, say, d3 later, opening up the discovered attack on the queen, but overall, black should be just fine. Here is a sample line. Bishop takes b5 is the best move. The king moves to d8, king d8, white castles, and then we go bishop b7. And overall, black is doing relatively fine. And I do want to show you how fast things can go bad for white in this position. Let's say here he takes on e5. That is a massive mistake, as with one simple move, all of that potential of black's position comes unleashed in one move right here. Knight to f4. What is the idea? We have a triple attack on the pawn on g2. Obviously, black is threatening checkmate with the queen. Queen takes g2 would be mate if we have a free move. And here, what the heck is white supposed to do? If he goes g3, then knight to h3 is checkmate on the spot, as the bishop controls this diagonal. And it turns out the only way to delay mate is to give up literally as much material as possible. Bishop c6, then bishop takes queen f3, bishop takes g3, and then finally knight to h3 is checkmate anyway. So even if white plays the strongest sequence starting on move 6, c3, then b5, then bishop f1, black is going to get tremendous compensation and just really a brutal attacking position. So overall, let's start from the beginning. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, then knight g5, the fried liver attack, we can counter that with the very tricky idea of d5, then e takes, and then knight to d4. And here, black is getting great play no matter what. If white goes c3, then b5 is our weapon of choice. And if white goes d6, then queen takes is our idea, giving up the pawn on f7, knowing no matter what, black's going to get tremendous counterplay. This is just a brutal idea to counter the fried liver attack. And by the way, while you're here, if you want to know the main lines of the fried liver, I'm going to give a real fast overview. Was just kind of on the fly right here. After, let's say, knight g5, d5, e takes, here, knight d4 is a very tricky idea. It's a very powerful trap, but instead of that, knight to a5 may be a little bit stronger. This is the starting point of, the real variation here. Now, white normally goes bishop c4. There are other ideas. For example, d3 can defend the bishop, queen e2 might defend, but overall, bishop b5 is the main idea. Then black goes c6, white takes, black takes, and now the pawn on c6 is being defended by the knight. Therefore, white has to do something. Now here, the lines get, really, really crazy. There are a lot of ideas. I'll give you a fast overview. If white goes queen to f3, that is a tricky line. The point being, the pawn on c6 is pinned. If white takes, black takes the rook. Now, technically, c takes b5 is actually playable for black, and Ding Liren, one of the strongest black defenders of e4, e5, and the two knights defense in general, Ding Liren himself has actually played c takes b5 on many occasions, so it is playable. The line I like for black is actually giving up that pawn on c6. We go bishop e7, white takes, you take back, the queen takes, and then we go bishop d7, forcing the queen back. And from there, black gets tremendous play. If white goes queen to f3, our main idea is actually to go knight to g4 at some point, forcing back the knight. Then we go back to the h6 square, followed by perhaps knight f4, or knight f5, sorry, and then knight d4. Beyond queen f3, white has many other ideas. For example, bishop d3 is perhaps the main line of the entire variation. In that case, black's main idea is to go knight d5, immediately pressuring that knight. And if the knight goes back to, say, f3 or e4, then our idea is going to be knight to f4, pressuring the bishop once again, followed by perhaps bishop e7, d6, or c5, followed by short castles, and overall, black's going to have tremendous compensation for that missing pawn. But of course, these lines are very, very complicated. For example, white's idea is based on Even h4 here is actually very, very dangerous for white. There are a few different ideas for black here. For example, h6, queen c7. And finally, instead of bishop d3, white also has the idea of bishop e2. This line, though, isn't that strong. You just go h6, driving back that knight, and both after knight f3 or knight h3, black is doing just fine. So overall, the fried liver, starting with the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, and then knight g5, is just not that dangerous if you know what you're doing as black. If you want a trappy line for black, I recommend d5, d5, e takes, and then the move knight d4. This move is very, very tricky, but instead, if you want to play the main line, the strongest move, you're going to want to go knight to a5, chasing back that bishop, and again, the main tabia occurs after bishop b5, c6, d takes, b takes, and here white has many different ideas. Bishop d3, bishop e2, and queen to f3 are the main tries from white, but no matter what white does, black should be just fine with correct play. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of the video, your favorite idea or line from this variation. If you want to roast me, criticize me, do that as well, whatever you want to do. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. I'm doing my best to give you 2 new opening videos per day, every day, 7 days per week, and twice on Sunday. So if you want to see more really cool chess opening traps, opening ideas, and opening repertoires for white and black, please subscribe, smash that like button, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next video.